The phone call came in the spring of 1952, just months before Frank Sinatra agreed to take an $8,000 film role that almost no one wanted him to have. His manager had just told him that MCA, the most powerful talent agency in the country, was dropping him. Not suspending him, not renegotiating. Dropping him, the way you drop something you no longer need. Sinatra was 36 years old. A decade earlier, he had been the most famous singer in America, the man who made teenage girls faint in the aisles at the Paramount Theatre, the man whose fan mail arrived by the ton. Now, MCA wanted him gone. The question was whether anyone else would want him at all. 3 years later, Sinatra would be standing on one of Hollywood's most important stages, holding something almost no one believed he would ever receive. But in the spring of 1952, that outcome was not visible from where he was standing. What was visible was the drop. How far it had gone, how fast, and how much further it might still go. What happened between those 2 points is a story about a gamble, a role nobody wanted him to have, and a version of himself he had to become before he could return to the version everyone remembered. How does a man Hollywood has already written off convince anyone to give him one more chance? And what does it cost him to take it? Start with what he had lost. By 1952, the losses were not metaphorical. They were specific, auditable, the kind of losses that show up in account books and on cancellation slips. Columbia Records had dropped him in 1952 after a string of poor-selling singles. RCA had passed on signing him. His voice was giving him genuine medical trouble. In April of 1950, mid-engagement at the Copacabana in New York, he had suffered a submucosal hemorrhage of the vocal cords. He walked off stage one night, unable to make a sound. A doctor put him on complete vocal rest. The silence lasted weeks. When the voice came back, it was different, slightly lower, less of the easy soaring quality that had defined his early records, and he spent the next 2 years trying to find what was still there and how to use it. His marriage to Nancy Barbado, the woman he had been with since before the fame, ended in 1951. He had been involved with Ava Gardner since 1949, publicly and noisily, through the tabloid coverage that was less sympathetic then than it might be now. Gardner was one of the most beautiful women in the world and a genuine movie star, and she was wilder than Sinatra in ways that both attracted and undid him. They married in November 1951. The marriage was turbulent almost from the beginning in the way that two people of serious appetite and serious insecurity tend to be turbulent together. She would later say that she and Frank were too much alike. His television show, The Frank Sinatra Show on CBS, which ran from 1950 to 1952, had not found an audience large enough to justify its cost. It was canceled. His film contract with MGM, which had produced a run of pleasant, successful musicals through the 1940s, Anchors Away, On the Town, Take Me Out to the Ball Game, lapsed and was not renewed. MGM had no particular interest in what Sinatra represented in 1952. What he represented was diminishing returns. I want to be careful here about what I am and am not claiming. Some of the accounts of this period have the quality of myth building, the story of a hero at his lowest before the inevitable rise, with details sharpened in retrospect to make the reversal look starker. What is documented? The professional losses were real. The voice trouble was real. The recording contract endings were real. What is harder to know from the outside is the private experience of it, what it felt like from inside the diminishment, whether he believed it was temporary or whether there were stretches when he did not. What his friends said later was that he was not gracious about the decline. He was angry, frequently. He drank more than was good for him, which was not new, but the anger underneath the drinking was rawer than before. Ava Gardner said in her memoir that there were nights when he could barely stand the thought of himself. That is her account of him, and she had reasons both to be accurate and to be unkind, and I am not sure how to weigh it. What I can say is that the professional record of those years does not suggest a man handling difficulty with particular steadiness. The project that would change everything was not looking for Frank Sinatra. Columbia Pictures had acquired the rights to James Jones's novel, From Here to Eternity, in 1952. Jones had published the book the year before, and it had been a serious literary event. 858 pages set at the Schofield Barracks in Hawaii in the months before Pearl Harbor. A novel about enlisted men, about the Army's class structures and cruelties and occasional grace, about men trying to hold on to themselves in an institution designed to grind individual identity away. It was also sexually explicit in ways that were unusual for the period, and the studio's producer, Buddy Adler, and director, Fred Zinnemann, spent months working with screenwriter Daniel Taradash on a version that could get past the production code. They excised the brothel, softened the explicit content, kept the violence. What they kept was the emotional core. The film had a large ensemble. Burt Lancaster had been cast as Sergeant Milton Warden, the central figure, the one who holds the competing threads together. Montgomery Clift was set to play Private Robert E. Lee Prewitt, the bugler and boxer who refuses to fight and pays for it across the length of the novel. Donna Reed and Deborah Kerr were being assembled for the female roles. The remaining role of significant weight was Sergeant Angelo Majio, the small, volatile Italian-American private from New York, who is Prewitt's closest friend. Majio is not the film's largest part. He is not on screen as much as Lancaster or Clift. But he is essential to the emotional structure of the film. His death, beaten by a sadistic stockade sergeant, is what breaks Prewitt open and sets in motion the film's final movement. To play Majio convincingly required someone who could be simultaneously funny, tender, reckless, and genuinely heartbreaking. It required someone the audience would care about before they lost him. Eli Wallach was the first choice. Wallach had just come off Broadway, was trained at the Actors Studio, was part of the generation of serious method actors who were changing American film performance. He was interested in the role. Sinatra wanted it in a way that went beyond professional calculation. He had read the novel. Several people close to him said he had read it multiple times. He believed he understood Majio not as an actor studying a character, but as a man who recognized something in him, the scrappiness, the New Jersey Italian-American kid who had climbed out of something and was perpetually aware of how far he could still fall, the anger that was really fear with its surface inverted. He told people he was born to play this part. That kind of statement can be self-delusion or genuine self-knowledge, and sometimes those two things are not distinguishable from the outside. He contacted Ava Gardner, who was in Africa filming Mogambo with John Ford. Gardner knew Harry Cohn, the head of Columbia Pictures, in the complex, social professional way that everyone in that industry knew everyone else. Whether she directly interceded with Cohn or simply created an opening is something the accounts vary on. What is agreed is that Cohn became willing to consider Sinatra for the role. The audition, if it can be called that, was a meeting. Sinatra went in. He was tested, less formally than the usual screen test. What the studio saw was a man who had lost the easy confidence of his peak years and had something raw in its place, something that could be useful if it could be directed. Zinnemann was cautious. The concern was not that Sinatra couldn't act. He had demonstrated he could in certain moments, but that he was undisciplined, that he would be late, that he would not do multiple takes with patience, that he would bring the chaos of his personal life onto the set. Sinatra agreed to take the role for $8,000. At his height, he had earned many times that for far less work. He accepted the reduced fee not because he had to, though his financial situation was genuinely strained, but because he understood, or had been advised, that his leverage was gone, and that what mattered now was getting into the film. Eli Wallach, meanwhile, was offered a stage role that conflicted with the filming schedule. He took the stage role. The part was Sinatra'S. Now move forward to March 1953 to Columbia Pictures' set at Fort Ord and in the studio in Burbank. The shoot lasted roughly 41 days for the full production. Sinatra was on set for perhaps a dozen of those days, given Majio's relatively contained role. What happened on those days is documented in the accounts of people who were there and in the footage itself, which remains. Montgomery Clift was the performance that most observers focused on during filming. He was in the middle of a transformation of his own. He had been in a serious car accident in May 1956, which is to say this was before that, when he still had the original face and the physical ease and the full technical command. His pre-wit is one of the great performances of the decade. People who worked with him on From Here to Eternity remember him as meticulous, internally focused, sometimes difficult, but always serious. What they remember about Sinatra is different. He was on time. That alone surprised people who had expected otherwise. He knew the scenes. He did not always want to do multiple takes. There are accounts of tension with Zinnemann over this, but the takes he did give were present in a way that mattered. The scene of Majio drunk, picked up by military police, trying to stay light and defiant while the situation is clearly going against him, was reportedly done in 1 or 2 takes and required nothing from Zinnemann except to let it run. The scene where Majio dies, found by Prewitt in the road, broken after what the stockade sergeant has done to him, was the scene that people on set mentioned specifically when they talked about what they had seen Sinatra do. He said later, in more than one interview, that he had not needed to reach far for what Majio was feeling, that he had been through something of his own falling, that he understood what it felt like to be the funny one who uses humor as a way of managing fear, that the anger underneath Majio's lightness was familiar territory. Whether this is retrospective myth-making or genuine insight, the film contains the evidence. What the camera recorded is not someone pretending. It is someone inside something. Donna Reed, who would win Best Supporting Actress for the same film, said she watched Sinatra work and understood immediately that he was operating from a place of genuine feeling. Burt Lancaster was more measured in what he said publicly, but did not dispute the quality of what Sinatra did. The film opened in August 1953. The reviews were not uniform. They were better than that. Bosley Crowther in the New York Times called it one of the most honest and genuinely affecting films produced in Hollywood. The notice for Sinatra specifically named what he had done as a performance, not as a celebrity appearance, a distinction that mattered in the context of how critics had covered him during the decline years, when his name in a film was usually noted with the sense that the studio was coasting on a recognition factor that was itself eroding. The film became one of the highest-grossing releases of the year. The Academy responded with 13 nominations. It won 8, including Best Picture and Best Director for Zinnemann. Sinatra's nomination for Best Supporting Actor put him in competition with Eddie Albert, Brandon DeWilde, Jack Palance, and Robert Strauss. On the night of March 30th, 1955, he sat in the Pantages Theater with his hands folded in his lap and tried to look like a man who did not care very much about what was about to happen. When Mercedes McCambridge read his name out loud, the applause was long and genuine, the kind that holds something more than politeness in it, the kind that acknowledges a person has come back from somewhere and arrived at something real. He walked to the stage. He took the Oscar in both hands. He said he was deeply thrilled and very moved, and anyone who had watched the 4 years between 1952 and that night understood he was not performing the sentiment. What I find interesting about that moment, when I've watched the footage, is the specific texture of the applause. It has a quality that responses to comeback stories sometimes have, a warmth slightly different from ordinary enthusiasm. that contains within it some acknowledgement of what the audience knows about the person's route to the stage. They were not just applauding a performance. They were applauding the fact of the performance, the fact that there was a person up there who had been somewhere difficult and had produced something real on the other side of it. The period after the Oscar is where some accounts go soft, drawn into the temptation of treating the award as the arrival, the point at which everything resolved and the decline years became a tidy before. The truth is less tidy. His marriage to Gardner ended in 1953, legally concluded in 1957. They had separated and reconciled more than once. The dissolution was slow and complicated and painful, and the pain of it ran through the years of professional recovery alongside and underneath the recovery. His drinking did not become more moderate after the Oscar. His behavior toward people in his orbit, the anger, the unpredictability, the occasional cruelty, did not systematically improve. The professional ascent was real. The personal navigation of everything the decline had cost him was a longer and more uneven process. What the film did was restore the fundamental condition that everything else required. The sense, both within the industry and within Sinatra himself, that he was capable of producing work of genuine quality. Not commercial work, not nostalgic work, not the man who used to be something and can still trade on it. Work that was actually good. That foundation, once reestablished, made the rest possible. Capitol Records signed him in 1953 before the film even opened. He had begun working with Nelson Riddle, the arranger who would reshape his sound for the decade to come. In the wee small hours, songs for swingin' lovers, Come Fly With Me. Those records belong to the years immediately following, From Here to Eternity, and they are among the best work he ever did. The voice was lower than the Columbia years, less of the effortless high register, and he and Riddle built an aesthetic that used what the voice could do now, rather than pretending it was what it had been at 25. The result was a sound more emotionally complex than what he had made before. The sound of a man who understood more about loss than he had when he started. There is a version of this story, the one that reduces to a single lesson, in which the Majio role is just the pivot point that separated the first half of Sinatra's career from the second. That version is not wrong, but it is not quite adequate either. What actually happened was more contingent than the arc shape suggests. Eli Wallach took a stage role. That was luck or something like it. The production needed someone, and the person who wanted it desperately was available and cheap. And the gamble of giving him the part, which was a gamble, no one in the room was pretending otherwise, came off. The footage was what it was. The rest followed. What Sinatra brought to the gamble was the years of reduction themselves. He had been stripped of the confidence that can sometimes substitute for depth. And what was left when the confidence went was something more useful for the specific work the role required. The humiliation of the declined years, the financial strain, the loss of the MGM contract, and the Columbia Records contract, and the television show, and the easy assumption that he would always be wanted. All of that had gotten into him. Majio needed a man who knew what falling felt like. Sinatra was qualified. His later public persona, the Rat Pack years, the Las Vegas incarnation, the chairman of the board construction. All of it sits downstream of 1953 and the 41 days of a film he agreed to make for $8,000 because he had run out of other options. He never forgot that. In interviews across the rest of his life, he returned to that film with something that was not exactly nostalgia, more like the specific gratitude a person has for a moment that let them prove something to themselves they needed to prove. He died in May 1998. He was 82. The voice had given out long before the body did. The last major concert tour was in 1994, and the performances at the end of that run were difficult to watch. The voice uncertain in ways it had never been, even at the worst of the early 1950s. He knew it. He canceled the final shows himself. At the funeral, They played the music. Not the Capitol records, which would have been the obvious choice, the lush riddle arrangements, the sound of the man at his most fully realized. They played My Way, which is the song most people would expect, the anthem he had made his, though he was privately ambivalent about it in later years, felt it had a braggadocio that wasn't entirely him. After that, they played Put Your Dreams Away, which had been his radio sign-off since the early days, since the Hoboken Kid, who had become something large, had wanted a song that could end an evening. The 41 days, the $8,000, the role nobody wanted to give him, the one or two takes in which something real happened on camera. Those are the mechanism by which everything that followed became possible. Not the comeback, as the story gets told, cleaned up and inevitable in hindsight. The actual mechanism, a desperate man, a part he recognized in himself, and a dozen days on a set where nobody expected anything and he gave them something they could not ignore.